Thank you very much. Great to be here in Brighton, talking in Brighton for once. So whilst I'm a local designer, born and bred, most of my work is kind of happening around the UK or actually in Europe. So much of my time is spent actually talking and presenting CPDs and seminars to architects and built environment stakeholders. My work covers all different sorts of areas. We work as kind of designers, lead designers, but also as design consultants. We have a research department in our practice, Oliver Heath Design, and also have sort of media career over the last 20 years, worked for sort of the likes of BBC, ITV, Channel 4, and if you're interested, my next show is on Wednesday evening on BBC DIY SOS, where I battle a load of belligerent builders. At 9 o'clock, I think I come out on top, but I have no idea. Anyway, over the last 20 years, and in part because of my TV work, I've had the opportunity to talk enthusiastically, I hope, about sustainability and why we should be incorporating it into buildings. But I've got to say it's been so frustrating trying to encourage people, particularly homeowners, of this impending situation that is so important to human civilization and our life on the planet. I mean, the planet's still going to be here when we manage to destroy it in our habitable sphere. You know, so it's how we look after ourselves. And trying to encourage people to adopt these ideas has just been really kind of frustrating over the last 20 years. And I think what we are seeing now is something of a resurgence, the likes of Greta Thunberg, a kind of interest in the plastics issue. You know, Blue Planet 2 has done amazing things. But over this period, you know, it has been a frustrating conversation trying to encourage people to adopt sustainability into their lives. And in part, you know, that's, you know, when we look at the reasoning, when we talk to organizations, the metrics now demonstrate that actually we understand why people aren't that engaged with the ideas of energy, in part because only 1% of typical business operating costs are in energy, things like gas and electricity. But what we're now seeing is a kind of divergence away from this carbon-centric conversation towards a more human-centered one. And I believe that good, sustainable architecture really needs to embrace both a carbon-centric model and a human-centered model, in part because 90% of typical business operating costs are in human costs, things like staff salaries and benefits. So clearly we need to reduce the impact of the buildings that we're living and working in, but also we need to respect that buildings are filled with people, and people are unpredictable, they're messy, we just don't know exactly what they're going to do, and they're very expensive. So maybe that's a way in. Now what I want to do today is talk to you about my favourite subject, which is all about health and well-being in buildings, this human-centred element, and in particular focus on one particular, probably more design-related aspect of that, which is biophilic design, which essentially is how we improve the human connection to nature in buildings that we live and work in. So, to put it into context, what we now have is a series of different building design standards, the likes of, well, we know we've got UK building standards, we've also got BREEAM and LEED, and those are very carbon-centric models. They focus really on the design and the construction. We're now seeing more human-centered building standards, the likes of the WELL standard, FitWell, Living Building Challenge, that are putting human-centered needs and health and well-being right at the very forefront of that design process. So it's really about the design, the construction, but also, importantly, the ongoing human occupation. Now, the WELL standard is the one that seems to be kind of coming into becoming most popular in the United Kingdom and across Europe. And basically within it at the moment, in version 1, there are 7 key concepts. They've got things like air quality, water quality, the serving delivery of food, light, fitness, comfort, and mental well-being. Now, as we tend to move down the list, we go from the more engineering-based subjects, the likes of air quality and water quality, down towards the more design-related aspects. And it's really in the mind section, all about mental well-being and how buildings can support mental well-being, that we find this one particular area about biophilic design. But I think what's important is that sort of like that one reference sort of belies the importance of bringing nature into buildings, because it's very much the living aesthetic of healthy buildings. And so it becomes much more important when we recognise that, you know, actually 80% of what we understand about the built environment is through our eyes. So very much about that kind of living aesthetic. And hopefully I'll demonstrate to you why it is so important over the course of the next 16 minutes. 15 maybe. So there are a number of reasons why health and well-being is rising up the built agenda at the moment. The World Health Organization has stated that the stress-related conditions of cardiovascular disease and mental health issues are likely to be the two prime contributing factors to illness by 2020. When we start to think about the financial issues, well, the Health and Safety Executive released their annual survey in 2018, demonstrating that stress accounts for 44% of all work-related ill health and 57% of all working days lost. So stress, the thing that we all experience so much of our time, is costing organizations an incredible amount of money. On top of that, the UK is now around 90% urbanised, so inevitably when we live in more urban spaces, they tend to be more geometric, greater levels of transport, poor air quality. We have a reduced connection to nature, of course we do. As well as that, we have very, very high rates and a proliferation of mobile technology. 93% of UK adults now have smartphones, never really more than 2 meters away from them at almost any point in our modern lives. And if you think back 20 years ago where we didn't have social media, smart technology, we might, when we weren't working, have a conversation with somebody or gaze out the window or just relax or recuperate. Now we always have that sense of directed attention. We're always looking at a screen. We just don't give ourselves the opportunity to relax and to recuperate in the way that we have literally done throughout human evolution. And that is enormously damaging to our activities, our health and well-being and productivity in so many of the buildings that are important in our modern day lives. So biophilia, what is that? Well, biophilia quite literally means a love of nature. It's a term that was popularized by the American biologist Edward O. Wilson in the 1980s. Subsequent to that, it was picked up by the American architect Stephen Kellett, who developed a framework of ideas that allowed us to improve that connection to nature in buildings. Since then, it's been developed again into what we now know as the 14 patterns of biophilic design, a more accessible approach. Stephen Kellett came up with a very creative 73 attributes, but the 14 patterns also works very well. And essentially it's a set of ideas that we can pick and choose from to help us to create buildings where we can be more alert and energized and stimulated, but also to create spaces that are calming, relaxing and restorative. So where does this come from? Well, essentially 99.5% of human evolution was spent in very close connection to healthy forms of nature for our very basic human survival. So many of the scenes that we see here are still fundamental to our understanding and appreciation of what constitutes good architecture. It's just we've become more sophisticated in our use of basic resources and our land use, and I think for many, even our dress sense, although it's not always easy to tell in Brighton. So many of these ideas, shelter, warmth, security, access to food and water and a sense of community are still fundamental to our health and well-being. And because of this vast amount of time spent in and around it through human evolution, an idea has been developed called the Savannah theory that suggests that we literally have a genetic inheritance that allows us to recognize landscapes that can help us to survive, thrive, and flourish, and equally to recognize landscapes that are potentially threatening to our survival. The theory sort of goes on to suggest that when we look out onto areas of nature from a point of prospect, it actually has the ability to reduce our heart rates, our blood pressure levels, to help us to relax and to recuperate from physical and emotional stress, and to get back to being at our best. Now, if we were to look at this scene here, when we look out onto the scene, we immediately can recognize this is a lush, healthy environment, and even from our modern urbanized way of thinking, we can recognize that this is a landscape that can help us to survive. We know that, and firstly, because it's green, it's lush, it's healthy, and that lushness attracts potential prey in the form of animals. We've got trees and vegetation to give us fruit and vegetables, wood for burning, stone for building and for weapons, water for hydration. And of course, we're seeing all of this from this point of prospect with lots of natural light flooding down, so we can orientate ourselves, we can see potential targets and even potential threats. So lots of the ideas behind biophilic design are kind of very neatly wrapped up by this idea of the Savannah theory. The problem is, of course, that we live in urbanized spaces. So how do we translate these ideas into the many complex spaces that are so important to our modern day lives? Well, luckily, we have biophilic design. So there are three key constructs to biophilic design. The first is about this direct connection to nature. It's how we bring natural plants, trees, water, light into spaces. Secondly, it's recognizing that in so many spaces that we live and work in, we don't have any opportunity to bring any of those direct connections in. So it's about using indirect connections. So it's about how we use natural materials, colors, textures, patterns, and even technologies to evoke or to mimic a sense of nature. And thirdly, it's about the human spatial response. It's recognizing that we need to create spaces that are exciting and stimulating and aspirational, spaces that we want to be in, but equally to create spaces that help us to deal with the many stresses and strains of our modern lives, to create spaces that can help us to relax, to recuperate our mental and physical energy. Now, these three ideas have been developed, as I've said, into different ways. This is what we call the 14 patterns of biophilic design, created by Terrapin Bright Green, who are based in the United States. So you'll see that there are sort of 7 direct connections to nature, 3 in the indirect, and another 4 in the human spatial response. So all of these are the kind of little attributes that we can use to kind of bring that sense of nature into buildings. And sadly, I don't have the chance today to go into all of those. But what fascinates me about biophilic design is it's underpinned by an evidence base of research that goes back over the last 20 to 30 years that demonstrates the enormous potential value of what happens when we bring some of these natural elements into spaces where we experience stress in the city, in workplaces, in schools and hospitals, and even into our homes. So this one particular study showed that actually when elements of nature, such as plants, have been brought into spaces, it can increase productivity by 15%. It's kind of an amazing number. When natural features have been applied, there's a 15% reduction in absenteeism. One of the factors that I find really interesting that kind of people already know about is natural light. Natural light is kind of one of the kind of most obvious biophilic elements. And one of the reasons why it's so important is sort of demonstrated by this. This is a chart of our circadian rhythms. And our circadian rhythms are our body's reactions to periods of light and dark across a 24-hour period. It affects our mood, our behavior, and our hormone release of melatonin and serotonin, which are our body's sleep-wake hormones. So in the middle, you see the kind of different color temperatures of light that we have in the middle, kind of throughout 24-hour period, and beyond that, the body's reactions to these subtle cues and color temperature. Now, the problem exists in our modern-day society in that we spend 90% of our lives indoors, and particularly at the kind of fringes of the daytime, let's say at night when we're lying in bed with the light on and we've got the TV on, maybe we're double screening if we're feeling naughty, with a tablet or a smartphone, or maybe you've got all 3 on if you're really bad. And you know that thing about being kind of physically tired, and yet you kind of like put your phone down and suddenly you're like tired, but you can't go to sleep. Your brain's still whirring. And that is essentially a disruption of your body's circadian system. And when we don't sleep well, all sorts of bad things happen. And there's perhaps no greater living example of what happens when we don't sleep well than President Donald Trump, who boasts he only needs 3 hours sleep. And when you see some of the things that happen when you don't sleep well, it rather explains the reason why this man should not have a Twitter feed. When you don't sleep well, you get a bit irritable, you get a bit grumpy, so it affects your interpersonal relationship or maybe intercontinental relationship. It affects your ability to focus, to concentrate. You get easily distracted, make mistakes. But there are also longer-term health issues to poor sleep, a risk of diabetes, obesity, and depression. So getting a good night's sleep is absolutely fundamental. And our exposure to natural light, the influence of technology, and how we manage that is absolutely key to it. The other area that is so important is actually this indirect connection to nature. And what the research studies demonstrate is that even simulated elements of nature can facilitate stress reduction. So it's not as beneficial as that multi-sensory thing of being in the middle of nature, in the forest or in the woods or in a field, because it's not as sort of multi-sensory. But what is interesting for me as a designer is that my design choices, the specifications I make, can help people to reduce stress, to just kind of overcome the physical and psychological issues that are associated with it, to create better, happier and healthier spaces. Over the last 5 years, I've been working alongside carpet manufacturers Interface that Duncan mentioned. What's interested me about them is that they take both the circular economy method of production in that they use a biomimetic approach to the design and the construction and production of their carpet tiles, meaning that they use renewable energies, zero waste to landfill, they recycle their materials, they use recycled materials in them. But also they take that biomimetic approach into the design of their carpet tiles. So many of the products they actually produce mimic natural materials, be that kind of stone or grass or moss. And what that allows us to do is to introduce a sense of biophilic design, or biophilia, quite literally from the ground up, with something as simple as a carpet tile. And for me, that is kind of the holy grail. How do we join that carbon-centric whole life approach of the circular economy, along with a more human-centered approach? And Interface is one of those kind of leading companies who are just doing really fascinating things. Now, there's, as I said, evidence that demonstrates the benefits of biophilic design in all sorts of different areas. In the workplace, we know that it helps to reduce costs, things like absenteeism, presenteeism, but also improve productivity, things like creativity and staff retention. A study that came out about 3 years ago, it surveyed 7,600 office workers in 16 different countries. What it found was that 85% of those people now work in urban spaces. Rather shockingly, 47% of people don't have natural light, affecting their sleep. 58% don't have plants, affecting their ability to reduce stress and aid recuperation. But the things that they did say was that when they found themselves working in spaces that had natural elements, they self-reported a 15% higher level of well-being, were 6% more productive and 15% more creative. So what's interesting about this is it demonstrates the real value of the sort of services that we can deliver if we take a human-centered approach. Now, the benefits to education in this one particular study, what they found was that when students' exposure to natural light was optimized, there could be an increase in the speed of learning by between 20 and 25%. It could improve attendance rates and improve test scores by between 5 and 14%. So quite significant numbers that really may have made a significant difference to my own education, even here in Brighton. This is an interesting study. The choice of materials can affect the way people feel in spaces. In this one particular study by the Jonin Research Institute, they found that students who work in classrooms that are clad with timber have a reduced heart rate of 8,600 beats per day. You know, that's amazing. They actually have less heart rate, lower heart rates, less stress, lower anxiety. They can more able to focus on what's going on in the classroom. Okay. I'm running out of time a little bit, so I'm going to just kind of move on. There are multiple benefits to bringing an element of nature into all sorts of building typologies. In healthcare, the studies have shown that actually when patients can recuperate in rooms that look out onto greenery, it can do so, reducing their recuperation rates by 8.5%. Natural light, when they're recuperating, can actually make patients feel less pain and reduce their medication rates by 22%. In the hospitality world, we all know that if you're going to book the best room with the best view overlooking the beach, the forest, the mountains, it's going to cost us a little bit more. This study demonstrates that actually guests are prepared to pay 23% more. So again, an obvious business case. And in our domestic environment, it's obviously difficult to measure financial uplift and maybe something like productivity. So what the research has actually demonstrated is actually reduction in crime, reduction in domestic violence, and some degree of property value increase. Plus, interestingly, I think when we are in and around nature, it puts us in a positive and optimistic state, which helps to build a sense of community. A lot of our work in my design practice and the research that we do is focused about how we can help designers and building stakeholders bring biophilic design in. It's not about shoving a massive green wall into a space. There are loads of little things you can do, from the low cost, like the installation you see on the left-hand side that we created, to the high cost. This is a proposal by Thomas Heatherwick and Bjarke Ingels Group. And we sort of subdivided this into a number of different ways, what we call strategies, from the low cost, which is about very simple things that you can do to an existing space. The medium cost might be the ways that you can bring it into a standard and affordable refurbishment or design project. And the high cost might be about relying on some of those incredible materials and technologies that are out there at the moment to improve our connection to nature. Now, this is something that we're currently doing at a world-leading project, a world first, at the Building Research Establishment in Watford. The BRE, as they're known, are the founders of BRIAM. They have a campus in Watford, and what we're doing is we're taking a whole floor of this building 18, on the right-hand side, and we're spending about 3 years doing a pre-occupancy survey, undertaking refurbishment, and then again a post-occupancy survey to really measure the benefits of biophilic design. Currently, it's a 1980s building, hasn't had anything really done to it since then. Quite a depressing building, but it was once an energy-efficient building. And we're transforming it into a space with 3 different key areas: a low-level intervention of biophilic design, a medium level, and a high level, and then a kind of future-facing co-working space in the yellow on the end. And we're working with some amazing core partners who are bringing different materials and technologies, and they're also testing those materials and the benefits to biophilic design. Throughout this period, we are going to be outputting information. This is a mood board for some of those very simple things that you can do, materials, textures, images of nature on walls. This is a visualization of the medium level, so you see natural materials on the walls, a more structured green planting system, colors, textures. Got a recuperation space over there with a pink sofa, opportunities for the occupants to view out. And then in the high level, we've integrated biomorphic design shapes that remind us of nature, natural colors and texture of the materials, some amazing technologies as well. So if you want to know more about this, go to the BRE/Biophilic Office project. We'll be outputting information over the next 2 years. There's also a conference in June if you wanted to come and take part in that. That's more or less it. Biophilic design is much more than just a kind of current trend. It's an evidence-based approach that demonstrates the enormous value of what happens when we improve that connection to nature. And there are multiple benefits. There are benefits for us as building stakeholders, as designers and professionals, because we get to deliver an evidence-based approach and better results. There are benefits for the building occupants who get to experience less stress and a better live-work balance. And of course, there are benefits for our clients, building and business owners who get to experience a reduction in costs and improvement in building outcomes. Plus, I think, importantly, there is an environmental benefit, that when we recognize that our health and well-being is intrinsically linked to the health and well-being of the natural environment, then we'll recognize a greater need and empathy and desire for the conservation of our planetary environment. Biophilic design is an essential component in the creation of happier and healthier places to live and work. It's better for people, it's better for productivity, and it's better for the planet. Thank you.